Here in the sauna. Ooh, Sal. She always gotta be talking. Oh my goodness. I'm gonna read. The decline of traditional Lao literature and the rise of modern literary tradition. The same factors that caused the transformation and decline of traditional literature essentially brought about the creation and development of modern Lao writing. In the late 17th century, the kingdom of Lansang split into three smaller kingdoms. The subsequent weakness of the Lao led to internal instability, followed by dependence upon and eventual domination by foreign powers. By the end of the 18th century, the region that had once comprised Lansang had largely fallen under the political control of the Thai. At the end of the 19th century, Siam was forced to cede to the French their Lao territories east of the Mekong River, an area that approximates the modern political entity of Laos. The Thai and French did not immediately have a significant cultural impact on the Lao. Before the final years of the 19th century, the Thai were mostly content to preserve indigenous cultural and political systems and depended on the local elite to deliver tribute and taxes. The French similarly viewed the development of Laos as a low priority in comparison with the neighboring colonies of Vietnam and Cambodia. Which showed greater economic potential. The traditional culture of the Lao, therefore, did not undergo a great transformation until the 1930s or afterward. The state institutionalization, wow, how many vowels is that? Institutionalization, 8 syllables. The state institutionalization of secular education in 20th century Southeast Asia has had a profound effect on traditional cultures throughout the region. Lao art forms, including literature, were marginalized as the power of their patron. The Buddhist temple was reduced, and religious education was replaced by modern schools with a Western-oriented curriculum. Traditionally, literature served the temple by teaching an individual to accept his place within Lao society and the greater Buddhist world. Where was I? Lao art forms, including literature, were marginalized as the power of their patron, the Buddhist temple, was reduced, and religious education was replaced by modern schools with a Western-oriented curriculum. Traditionally, literature served the temple by teaching an individual to accept his place within Lao society and the greater Buddhist world. Lao education under the French was tailored to suit a different goal. Students who attended French schools in Laos were taught to see themselves as colonial subjects in a world with France at its center. In neighboring northeastern Thailand, students were educated to be citizens of a country under the political and cultural domination of the Central Thai. As traditional literature appeared to discourage rather than encourage modern educational objectives, it ceased to be taught. Elements of traditional Lao culture came to be viewed as remnants of an undeveloped past, whereas Western civilization was admired as a model for emulation. During the colonial period, Lao students educated at government schools were exposed to French literature in place of that of the Lao. Secular prose fiction, previously unheard of in Lao society, became fashionable among the upper class, replacing poetic epics in prominence. Exposure of the Lao elite to French literature at school and their emulation of the literature led to the origin of modern Lao fiction. The fact that traditional literature continues to remain a living tradition in Laos in the present day is testimony both to limited availability of government education to much of the country's inhabitants. The inability of modern schooling to transform the worldview of the Lao in comparison with the majority of nations in Southeast Asia. The introduction and spread of modern education proceeded at a sluggish pace throughout Laos. The first lycée, upper-level high school, in the nation's capital was not established until 1947. Shortly before independence, in the larger towns outside the capital, middle school was the highest educational level available, and in the rural areas where the majority of the people lived, government education was non-existent. Students who wished to further education had no alternative but to study at a temple or go abroad. Statistics taken from the mid-1930s taken from the mid-1930s show that twice as many Lao were being educated in the temples as in government schools. 1988. Even in the present, many of the rural communities in Laos were lacking in schools, teaching materials, and qualified teachers. A second important factor that retarded the growth of a modern literature was the slow development of modern technology. Although printed publications in Laos date from the 1920s, the first Lao language newspaper to appear on a regular basis was not until the early 1940s. Considerably, later than in most of the nations within the region. Considerably later than in most of the nations within the region. Until the middle of this century, the primary method of reproducing a manuscript in Laos was the centuries-old practice of transcribing text into strips of palm leaves with a stylus. In the 1930s, it was common for monks in Vientiane to take In the 1930s, it was common for monks in Vientiane to take traditional Lao stories published in the more technologically advanced region of northeastern Thailand and copy them onto palm leaves for the purpose of circulation. The rugged geography of Laos, with its extensive mountain ranges and forests, has also proved a formidable obstacle to the country's development. Certain areas of Laos remain isolated from substantial contact with the outside world, although the situation is changing rapidly at present. The origins of modern literature during the French colonial period, 1893 to 1954. The earliest works do re 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 me 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 me. The earliest works of modern literature in Laos were composed and circulated exclusively among members of the Lao elite, predominantly in the capital city of Vientiane. In contrast to the majority of their countrymen, the Lao nobility studied at schools where the sole language of instruction was French, and French history, culture, and literature were taught in place of their own. Many continued their education in France. Members of the Lao elite frequently became more knowledgeable in matters related to French society and culture than the traditions of Laos. Prince Suvarnabhuma, for example, who was later to serve as Prime Minister of Laos for approximately 2 decades, felt more comfortable conversing in French than in Lao. Modern Lao literature was originally composed in the French language and imitated French literary styles. Wow. Okay. La 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 ling la ling lang ling ling ling. Literary styles. French literary styles. Imitated French literary styles. The first modern novel composed in Lao, Pra Pu Tat Hu Saksik, the sacred Buddha image. Put the hoop, Pra Putta Hoop Saksi, the sacred Buddha image, by Som Chin Yin, was published in 1944. The author wrote the introduction to the work in French and, presumably due to the novelty of publishing a work in Lao, advertised on the cover, written in easy-to-read Lao language. The motivation behind certain works of literature during this time was also overtly political in nature under the leadership of Field Marshal P. Boon Song Kram in the 1940s. The neighboring nation of Siam sought to absorb Laos and other territories under European colonial rule as part of a greater Siamese state. Whereas French remained the official language of Laos during colonial rule, in the years immediately preceding the Second World War, the use of the Lao language and culture were officially promoted in an attempt to forge a Lao national identity distinct from that of the Thai. In so doing, the intent of colonial administrators was to discourage Lao cultural affinity with the people of Siam. Lao literature from the Second World War to the Communist victory, 1945 to 1975. Lao literature from the Second World War to the present reflects the turbulence of the country's politics. To understand the literature, it is therefore necessary to review Lao history during this period. In the final years of French colonial rule, a nationalist movement known as the Free Lao, Lao Isra, was established under the leadership of several Lao princes. And we read that already. Lao literature under the Royal Lao government, 1954 to 1975. Lao literature in this category was composed and circulated primarily in Vientiane. Publishing in Laos was still a very basic stage in the 1950s. A few monthly magazines appeared during this period, some of which included literary content. By the mid-1960s, short stories were regularly featured in newspapers and magazines, and books of fiction began to appear. Major writers of fiction included Pakian Pa Nai, Dara Duang Champa, and Duang Duan Dakhet, who were children of Mahasila Viravong. An important scholar of traditional Lao history, culture, and literature, Utin Buivong was also a prominent author. French and Thai literature formed a major influence on Lao writing throughout the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s. Whereas Lao people continued to learn French to the level where they could read and appreciate Lao and appreciate French literary works, the Thai language is similar enough to Lao to be understood without great difficulty. By the early 1970s, there was an audience large enough to support the existence of a popular magazine devoted solely to literature. Initially, Puan Gao, followed by Pai Nam, which lasted until 2 months after the revolution. Pai Nam was founded by the Lao scholar Mahasila Viravong. The editorial board consisted largely of his children, who were its major contributors. Lao revolutionary literature, early 1950s to 1975. According to official Lao sources, revolutionary literature develops from the traditional literature of the common people of Laos, which expressed the people's discontent with feudal rules and foreign domination. For example, the ancient Lao poetic work San Lupa San was or has been interpreted as coded resistance to Thai invaders during the early 19th century and taught to Lao school children as an example of the love that the Lao have traditionally felt for the homeland. However, regardless of the extent to which political sentiment was expressed in traditional form in the past, literature composed in the liberated zones of the Lao Patriotic Front and subsequently contemporary literature has developed according to the directives of the Lao Revolutionary Movement. Much like the Buddhist temple, the Lao Patriotic Front made considerable use of traditional literary forms to convey the political message to the Lao people. During the 2 decades that followed the Second World War, Lao revolutionary literature was composed primarily in ancient poetic forms. Even at present, a considerable percentage of the literature published in Laos is written in traditional verse. Until the mid-1960s, prose narratives consisted of articles, reports, and occasional story by staff and soldiers of the Lao Patriotic Front in their newspaper, Lao Isara. Articles in Lao Isara typically consisted of the life stories of Lao men and women of various ethnic groups who sacrificed personal interests for the cause of the revolution. Idolized portrayals of revolutionary heroes were the model for many later works of Lao fiction. By 1965, short stories commonly appeared in the newspaper of the Lao Patriotic Front and in book form. Whereas Lao revolutionary fiction was originally composed in the style of a report, considerations of an artistic nature grew in importance with the development of the literature. Lao literature from 1975 to the present. From